February 15th, 1942. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walked through the ruins of Singapore under a white flag. Behind him, 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers prepared to surrender. The fortress they'd been told was impregnable had fallen in 7 days. The campaign to defend it had lasted 70 days. And the weapon that destroyed British power in Southeast Asia wasn't a tank. It wasn't a dive bomber. It wasn't superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. It was a bicycle. 70 days earlier, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita had landed in northern Malaya with roughly 30,000 men. The British had 85,000 troops defending the peninsula and Singapore. The Japanese were outnumbered nearly 3-1. British military planners weren't worried. 700 miles of dense jungle separated the landing zones from Singapore. The terrain was impassable. The Japanese would bog down in the rainforest, just like every invader before them. Except Yamashita had a plan the British never imagined. His soldiers would use captured bicycles to move faster through the jungle than any mechanized unit could. They would carry 90 pounds of equipment per man. They would advance day and night without rest. And when the tires blew out from the tropical heat, they would ride on the metal rims, creating a thunderous sound that terrified defenders into thinking tanks were coming. Winston Churchill would later call the fall of Singapore, quote, "the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history." End quote. The campaign that led to it became known as the Bicycle Blitzkrieg, and it changed the course of World War II in the Pacific. This is how it happened. Every verified fact, every documented tactic, and the brilliant, brutal efficiency of Japan's most unconventional invasion. On January 1st, 1941, a Japanese staff officer named Colonel Tsuji Masanobu reported to a small research office in Taipei. His assignment: figure out how to conquer Malaya and capture Singapore. The obstacles were staggering. The Malayan Peninsula stretched over 700 miles from north to south. Most of it was covered in thick jungle that the British called impassable. The roads were few. The climate was brutal, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity that rotted equipment. And at the southern tip sat Singapore, the most heavily fortified British base in Asia. Tsuji wasn't a field commander. He was a planner, and he approached the problem like an engineer. First, intelligence. He flew 2 long reconnaissance missions over northern Malaya and southern Thailand, mapping terrain and identifying weaknesses in British defenses. What he saw changed everything. The British had positioned their forces to defend against a naval attack from the south. Their heavy guns faced the sea. Their airfields were concentrated around Singapore. The northern approaches were lightly defended because the British believed the jungle was an impenetrable barrier. They were wrong. Second, training. Tsuji created a manual called "Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won." It explained tropical warfare, jungle survival, and how to move quickly through terrain and the enemy thought was impassable. Japanese units rehearsed amphibious landings on Hainan Island and in southern China, training in conditions identical to what they'd face in Malaya. They practiced river crossings, bridge building, and moving through dense vegetation. Most importantly, they trained to use bicycles. The bicycle idea seemed ridiculous at first. How could soldiers on bikes move faster than trucks? How could they carry enough supplies? But Tsuji had done the math. Bicycles originally manufactured in Japan had already been exported throughout British Malaya. Thousands of them. They would be readily available for requisition after the invasion. A soldier on a bicycle carrying 90 pounds of equipment could cover 40 to 50 miles per day on paved roads. Through the jungle on footpaths, they could still move faster than infantry on foot. And unlike trucks, bicycles didn't need fuel. They were silent. They could cross damaged bridges by being carried. And when organized in large columns, they could transport massive amounts of supplies that would otherwise require motorized transport. General Yamashita Tomoyuki was given command of the operation. He was 56 years old, an experienced staff officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics. The forces assigned to him were formidable. The 5th Division, veterans of combat in China and considered one of the best in the Japanese Army. The 18th Division, also experienced and well-trained. And the Imperial Guards Division, an elite formation that had never seen combat. Total strength, approximately 60,000 men, though only about 30,000 would participate in the initial landings. Yamashita also had a tank regiment, 3 regiments of engineers, and close coordination with the Japanese Navy and Army Air Force. The plan was simple, but audacious. Land simultaneously at multiple points in northern Malaya and southern Thailand. Advance rapidly down both coasts and through the central jungle. Use speed and surprise to keep the British off balance. Never give them time to establish defensive lines. And above all, maintain momentum. The British had more troops, but if the Japanese could move faster and concentrate their forces at critical points, they could defeat the defenders piecemeal before they could organize a coordinated response. On December 8, 1941, the invasion began. At 4 a.m. on December 8, 1941, Japanese bombers struck Singapore. It was the first air raid on the colony. 1 hour and 20 minutes later, Japanese naval aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War had begun. But the critical battle wasn't in Hawaii. It was in Malaya. Japanese amphibious forces landed at 3 points: Kota Baru on the northeastern coast of Malaya, and Singora and Patani in southern Thailand. The Thai military resisted for about 8 hours before signing a ceasefire and a treaty of friendship with Japan. The Japanese now had access to Thai roads and airfields. Within 48 hours, Japanese Army Air Force fighters and bombers were operating from Thai bases, giving them control of the skies over northern Malaya. Then came the bicycles. Thousands of soldiers, each carrying a heavy load, began cycling south on the main roads. When they encountered British defensive positions, they didn't stop to assault them frontally. Instead, Japanese engineers found paths through the jungle and outflanked the defenders, forcing them to retreat or be cut off. This happened again and again. The British would establish a defensive line. The Japanese would find a way around it. And before the British could regroup, Japanese bicycle troops would be behind them, cutting roads and threatening their supply lines. The sound was terrifying. When bicycle tires blew out from the heat and rough roads, Japanese soldiers learned to ride on the metal rims. Hundreds of bicycles rolling on pavement created a noise like approaching tanks. British and Indian troops, many of whom had never faced Japanese forces before and were already terrified of Japanese armor, would hear that sound in the darkness and panic. They would abandon positions before the enemy even arrived. Japanese commanders exploited this psychological effect ruthlessly. They would send bicycle columns down roads at night, creating maximum noise, while infantry moved through the jungle silently to attack from unexpected directions. On December 10th, disaster struck the Royal Navy. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, the only British capital ships in the Pacific, were sunk by Japanese naval aircraft off the coast of Malaya. In a single afternoon, Britain lost its ability to threaten Japanese naval operations. The defenders of Malaya were now completely isolated. The Japanese advance was relentless. City after city fell. Kota Baru, Penang, Ipoh, Kuala Lumpur fell on January 11th without resistance. Each time the British tried to establish a defensive line, Japanese forces would appear where they weren't expected. The jungle the British said was impassable became a highway for Japanese infantry. British commanders kept waiting for the Japanese to outrun their supply lines. It never happened. The bicycle troops were carrying their own supplies, and they were living off captured British stores. There were moments of fierce resistance. On January 14th, Australian troops from the 8th Division fought the Japanese at Jamas and the Gamentia Bridge. The battle was brutal. Japanese forces suffered up to 600 casualties. But Japanese engineers repaired the destroyed bridge in 6 hours. The advance continued. By the end of January, the entire Malayan Peninsula was in Japanese hands. The campaign that British planners thought would take 6 months had taken 55 days, and now the Japanese stood at the Johor Strait, looking across the water at Singapore. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. Newspapers called it the Gibraltar of the East. Its heavy 15-inch naval guns could destroy any fleet that approached. But those guns faced south, toward the sea. And on February 8, 1942, General Yamashita attacked from the north. The assault began with a massive artillery barrage on the northwestern section of Singapore's defenses. Then, Japanese troops launched amphibious landings under cover of darkness. The defending units, the Australian 8th Division, fought back hard. They inflicted severe casualties on the initial landing waves. But in the confusion of night combat, Australian commanders ordered a retreat when it wasn't necessary. The Japanese gained a foothold. Subsequent waves landed unopposed. Inside Singapore, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Over 1 million civilians were packed into the city. Japanese bombers struck daily. Artillery fire increased. The British had supplies for a long siege, but not the will to fight. Lieutenant General Percival, commander of Singapore's garrison, had 85,000 troops. But many units were under strength. Most lacked combat experience. Morale was shattered after the retreat down the peninsula, and the water supply was failing. Damaged pipes were losing thousands of gallons per day. Churchill sent desperate messages from London. Quote, "There must at this stage be no thought of saving the troops or sparing the population. The battle must be fought to the bitter end at all costs. The honor of the British Empire and of the British Army is at stake. The whole reputation of our country and our race is involved." End quote. But Churchill didn't understand. The battle was already lost. Yamashita had concentrated his forces at the weakest points. His air force controlled the skies. His artillery was destroying defensive positions faster than they could be rebuilt. And his troops, hardened by 70 days of continuous combat, were pushing deeper into the city. On the morning of February 13th, Percival called a conference with his senior commanders. He announced orders to fight to the finish. General Lewis Heath said his troops were exhausted and dispirited. There was no point in further fighting. General Gordon Bennett, commanding the Australian forces, argued that surrender was the only option. Heath reportedly told Percival, quote, "You need not think about your honor. You lost that a long time ago up in the north." End quote. On February 15th, Yamashita demanded unconditional surrender for the second time. At the negotiating table in the Ford Motor Factory, Yamashita banged his fist on the table and shouted, "Yes or no." He was worried the British would discover his forces were running low on ammunition. If the battle continued much longer, he might have to withdraw. But Percival didn't know that. At 6:20 post-meridiem, he signed the surrender. 80,000 troops became prisoners of war. Churchill was devastated. His personal physician later wrote, quote, "The fall of Singapore stupefied the Prime Minister. He felt it was a disgrace. It left a scar on his mind." One evening, months later, when he was sitting in his bathroom enveloped in a towel, he stopped drying himself and gloomily surveyed the floor. "I cannot get over Singapore," he said sadly, end quote. The fall of Singapore marked the end of an era. For over a century, European colonial powers had dominated Asia. The British Empire controlled India, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The Dutch held the East Indies. The French ruled Indochina. All of that ended in 70 days of combat. Because General Yamashita understood something the British didn't. Speed mattered more than strength. Mobility mattered more than firepower. And innovation mattered more than tradition. The bicycle blitzkrieg succeeded because it exploited every British weakness. The British assumed the jungle was impassable. Yamashita used it as a highway. The British concentrated their defenses in the south. Yamashita attacked from the north. The British expected a conventional campaign with set peace battles. Yamashita gave them constant movement and flanking maneuvers. And the British underestimated Japanese soldiers. They thought Asian troops were inferior to Europeans. They learned otherwise. The numbers tell the story. Japanese forces suffered approximately 9,600 casualties during the Malayan campaign. The British lost 130,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The 25th Army advanced 700 miles in 70 days. That's 10 miles per day through jungle terrain, across rivers, against a numerically superior enemy. No mechanized force could have moved that fast in that environment. Trucks required fuel and maintenance. Tanks couldn't cross the damaged bridges, but bicycles just kept rolling. After Singapore fell, the Japanese applied the same tactics throughout Southeast Asia. They conquered the Dutch East Indies. They invaded Burma. They threatened India. And everywhere they went, they used bicycles to move faster than their enemies expected. The psychological impact on Allied forces was profound. If Singapore could fall, nothing was safe. British prestige in Asia collapsed. Australia's Prime Minister declared that his country would now look to America for protection, not Britain. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. There was a darker side to the victory. 3 days after the surrender, Japanese forces began the Suk-Ching Purge. Thousands of Chinese civilians in Singapore were murdered in an operation designed to eliminate anti-Japanese elements. Prison camps became sites of brutality and starvation. Tens of thousands of Allied prisoners died building the Burma Railway. The Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia was marked by atrocities that would be prosecuted as war crimes after the conflict ended. Yamashita himself would face execution. In 1946, he was tried and convicted for war crimes committed by troops under his command in the Philippines. Whether he was personally responsible for those crimes remains controversial. Many historians argue he was no more guilty than other senior Japanese officers, and was executed largely because of his role in humiliating the United States and Britain in 1942. His legacy is complicated. The Tiger of Malaya, the man who conquered Singapore, and the general who proved that sometimes the simplest weapon, deployed with intelligence and speed, can defeat the most powerful fortress in the world. The British eventually retook Singapore in September 1945 after Japan surrendered. But the empire they'd fought to protect was gone. India gained independence in 1947. Burma and Malaya followed. Singapore itself would become independent in 1965. The fall of Singapore in 1942 didn't just end a military campaign. It ended 3 centuries of European colonial dominance in Asia. And it all started with a bicycle.